Montana Territory, 1875. The wind carried a chill that bit through cloth as surely as a rattlesnake through leather. Dust devils twisted across the scrubland that surrounded the small outpost of Silver Creek, a town barely clinging to existence in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. 24-year-old Daniel Zachary pulled his hat lower against the autumn sun, his blue eyes scanning the horizon from atop his dun gelding. Daniel had spent the better part of his youth believing that a man was defined by what he could survive alone. The harsh Montana wilderness had taught him that relying on others was a risk no sensible cowhand could afford. His father had abandoned their homestead when Daniel was 12, disappearing into a blizzard with half their savings and leaving his mother to die slowly of consumption. By 15, Daniel was on his own, drifting between ranches, learning to trust his horse more than any human companion. A man stands on his own 2 feet or he falls, Daniel often told himself. And in this territory, falling means dying. He wanted nothing more than to save enough for his own small ranch, a place where he answered to no one, depended on no one, and risked nothing of his heart. What he failed to recognize was his own crushing loneliness, the emptiness that expanded within him each night as he stared into campfires beneath vast, indifferent skies. Silver Creek came into view as Daniel crested the final hill, his week's wages secure in his pocket after delivering horses to the Army fort 30 miles north. The two-street town was little more than a collection of weather-beaten buildings, a general store, livery, saloon, and small hotel that doubled as a boarding house. Daniel planned to spend one night in a real bed before heading back to the Triple R ranch where he worked as a horse trainer. The commotion hit his ears before he saw it. Shouts from the direction of the stage depot. Daniel nudged his horse forward. Curiosity piqued despite his usual inclination to avoid other people's troubles. As he approached, he saw the stagecoach had arrived, but something was wrong. A crowd gathered around a young woman who stood defiantly beside her trunk, her dark blue traveling dress wrinkled from days of hard travel. "I have paid for my room in advance," she declared, her voice carrying notes of both refinement and determination. "I fail to see how my arrangements have suddenly become impossible." Daniel couldn't help but notice her. She was striking, not in the painted way of saloon girls, but with a natural beauty that seemed almost out of place in this dusty corner of the frontier. Her chestnut brown hair was coming loose from its pins, falling in soft waves around a face that couldn't have seen more than 20 summers. Her eyes, the color of spring meadows, flashed with intelligence and frustration. The hotel proprietor, a stout man named Jenkins, shook his head. "Miss, I told you. There's been a mistake. We got no record of your reservation or payment. With the mining convention in town, there ain't a spare room to be had." "This is absolutely unacceptable," she replied, clutching a letter in her gloved hand. "I have traveled for 2 weeks to reach this place. I cannot simply, ain't my problem, miss." Jenkins cut her off. "Unless you got somewhere else to go, the stage heads back east tomorrow morning." Daniel saw something flash across her face, not disappointment, but fear. Real fear. She glanced over her shoulder, scanning the faces in the small crowd as if looking for someone who might be watching her. Before he could think better of it, Daniel dismounted and approached. "Afternoon," he said, tipping his hat. "Seems like there might be a misunderstanding here." The young woman turned to him, wariness evident in her posture. Up close, Daniel could see the exhaustion beneath her composed expression and the way her hands trembled slightly. "Miss." Daniel paused, waiting for her to supply a name. "Beatrice," she said after a hesitation so brief he almost missed it. "Beatrice Zimmerman." Daniel nodded. "Miss Zimmerman was expecting accommodations," he said to Jenkins. "Surely there must be something available." "Not a single room," Jenkins insisted. "Mining engineers and investors have booked everything from here to Helena." Daniel felt himself doing something he rarely did, involving himself in someone else's problems. "Mrs. Holloway at the edge of town takes boarders sometimes. I could escort Miss Zimmerman there." Relief and suspicion battled in Beatrice's expression. "That's very kind, Mr. Zachary." "Daniel Zachary." He offered a slight bow. "I work at Triple R Ranch about 10 miles south. I'm in town for supplies." Beatrice studied him, making no effort to hide her assessment. Daniel knew what she saw, a young cowboy in worn but clean clothes, lean from hard work rather than hardship, his face tanned but not weathered by the elements, with just a day's stubble on his jaw. His light brown hair needed cutting, but he'd taken pains to wash the trail dust from it before entering town. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Zachary, but I cannot impose." A commotion at the far end of the street interrupted her. 3 riders entered town, dust billowing behind them. They rode hard, with purpose, scanning the faces of people on the boardwalk as they passed. Daniel noticed how Beatrice stiffened, turning her back to the newcomers and drawing her shawl closer around her shoulders. "On second thought," she said quietly, "I would be most grateful for your assistance, Mr. Zachary." Daniel glanced between Beatrice and the approaching riders. Her reaction told him everything he needed to know. "Follow me," he said, taking the handle of her trunk. "We'll see about that room." As they walked away from the stage depot, Beatrice kept her head down. Daniel led his horse by the reins, creating a barrier between her and the main street. He didn't ask questions, not yet, but he could feel the tension radiating from her. Mrs. Holloway, a widow who had come west with her late husband during the gold rush of '63, did indeed have a spare room. After a brief negotiation and an advance payment from Beatrice's carefully counted funds, the older woman showed them to a small but clean bedroom at the back of her modest home. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Holloway informed them. "No gentlemen callers after 8, and no spirits on the premises." When they were alone in the hallway, Beatrice turned to Daniel. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Zachary. I can manage from here." Daniel nodded, but hesitated at the door. "Those men who rode in are no concern of mine," she said quickly. Too quickly. "Miss Zimmerman," Daniel said carefully, "I don't mean to pry, but if you're in some kind of trouble, I assure you, I am not." The tremor in her voice betrayed her. Daniel had spent years reading horses, knowing when they were spooked or about to bolt. Beatrice Zimmerman had the same look in her eyes, the awareness of danger and the desperate calculation of escape routes. "I'll be at the livery if you need anything," he said finally. "I leave for the Triple R tomorrow noon." Relief washed over her features. "Good day, Mr. Zachary." Daniel tipped his hat and left, but instead of heading straight to the livery, he circled back to the main street. The 3 riders had stopped at the saloon. From across the street, he observed them, hard men with the look of hired guns rather than cowboys or prospectors. Their clothes were too fine for ranch hands, but not fine enough for businessmen. Something about their purposeful arrival and Beatrice's reaction stirred an unfamiliar protective instinct in Daniel. It was foolish, he knew. Whatever trouble the young woman was in, it wasn't his concern. The frontier had taught him that minding his own business kept a man alive. Yet as he stabled his horse and secured a room above the livery, Daniel found himself unable to stop thinking about Beatrice Zimmerman and the fear in her eyes. That evening, as Daniel sat in the small dining room of the boarding house where he'd secured lodging, the door opened to admit Beatrice. Their eyes met, and a flash of recognition passed between them. After a moment's hesitation, she approached his table. "Mr. Zachary," she said with a polite nod. "May I join you?" Daniel stood and pulled out a chair. "Please." As they ate a simple meal of stew and cornbread, Beatrice carefully steered their conversation to neutral topics: the weather, the beauty of the Montana landscape, the progress of the railroad. Daniel noticed how she revealed almost nothing of herself while asking questions that encouraged him to talk about his work at the ranch. "You seem to understand horses well," she observed after he described breaking a particularly difficult stallion. "Better than people, most days," Daniel replied, surprising himself with his candor. "Horses don't lie about what they want or who they are." Something softened in Beatrice's expression. "That's a rare quality in this world, being exactly what you appear to be." Before Daniel could respond, the door swung open again. One of the men who had ridden into town earlier entered, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Beatrice. She went rigid, her spoon clattering against her bowl. The man approached their table, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "Well now," he drawled, "ain't this a surprise? Miss Beatrice Zimmerman, all the way out here in Montana territory." Daniel tensed, reading the situation instantly. "Evening," he said, his voice level. "My friend and I were just finishing our meal." The man ignored him, focusing on Beatrice. "Your father's mighty worried about you, miss. Sent us to bring you home safe." Beatrice's knuckles turned white around her napkin. "I doubt that very much, Mr. Rowe." Please give my father my regards and inform him that I have no intention of returning. Rose's smile didn't reach his eyes. Now, that ain't very daughterly. Man goes to all this trouble, sending us to find you. Daniel stood slowly. The ladies made her wishes clear. Now Rose acknowledged him, sizing Daniel up with a dismissive glance. This ain't your business, cowboy. I'm making it my business, Daniel replied evenly. A dangerous silence stretched between them. Daniel was acutely aware that he carried no firearm. His revolver was with his gear at the livery. Rose's hand twitched near his pistol. We'll be in town a few days, miss. Your father expects you home, one way or another. With a final threatening glance at Daniel, he turned and left the dining room. Beatrice's composure cracked the moment the door closed. I should leave, she whispered. Tonight. Before they... She stopped herself. Before they what? Daniel asked quietly. Miss Zimmerman, I think it's time you told me what kind of trouble you're in. Beatrice looked down at her barely touched food. It's not what you think, Mr. Zachary. I'm not a criminal or a fugitive, at least not in the eyes of the law. She took a steadying breath. Those men work for my father. He wants me to return to St. Louis and marry a business associate of his, a man 3 times my age with a reputation for cruelty who has already buried 2 wives. Daniel listened as she continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. I refused to be sold like cattle to advance my father's business interests. So I fled, using money my late mother left me. I had arranged everything carefully. Passage west, a teaching position in Helena that begins next month, accommodations here until then. And your father sent men to bring you back, Daniel finished for her. Beatrice nodded. They will not take no for an answer. My father is not accustomed to being defied. Something in her story resonated with Daniel, the desire for freedom, for self-determination. It echoed his own reasons for choosing the hard but independent life of a cowboy. What will you do? He asked. I don't know, she admitted. I cannot stay here. They will make trouble for anyone who helps me. But I have nowhere else to go until the teaching position begins. Daniel made a decision that went against everything his lonely years had taught him. Triple R Ranch is looking for a cook's assistant. It's hard work, but you'd be 10 miles from town, and no one would think to look for a genteel young woman from St. Louis in a ranch kitchen. Hope flickered in Beatrice's eyes. You would help me? Why? You don't know me. Daniel considered her question. Why indeed? Perhaps because in her determination to forge her own path, he recognized something of himself. Or perhaps because for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a desire to protect someone besides himself. Let's just say I understand wanting to choose your own way, he finally answered. If you're willing to work hard and can leave at first light, I'll speak to Mrs. Johnson, our cook. She's been asking for help since spring. The smile that transformed Beatrice's face caught Daniel off guard. It was like watching the sun break through storm clouds, illuminating everything it touched. Thank you, Mr. Zachary, she said softly. I accept your offer. As they finalized their plans, Daniel felt the first crack forming in the wall he'd built around himself. He told himself it was simply the right thing to do, that anyone with decency would help a young woman in such circumstances. But deeper down, where he rarely allowed himself to examine, Daniel knew he was doing something dangerous. He was beginning to care. The journey to Triple R Ranch began in the gray light before dawn. Daniel had arranged for Beatrice to ride double with him until they were well away from town. Then she would ride the pack horse he'd purchased for supplies. They left Silver Creek with no incident, though Daniel noticed Rose watching them from the window of the hotel as they passed. Once they cleared the town limits, Daniel urged his horse into a canter. We'll cut south through Miller's Pass, he explained. It's longer but less traveled. With luck, they won't figure out where you've gone until we're well away. Beatrice sat behind him, her arms wrapped tentatively around his waist. What if they follow us to the ranch? I don't want to bring trouble to your employers. Triple R is one of the biggest spreads in the territory, with 20 cowhands who can all handle themselves. Those 3 won't be so bold there. As the miles passed beneath their horses' hooves, Daniel found himself increasingly aware of Beatrice's presence, the light pressure of her hands at his waist, the occasional brush of her cheek against his shoulder when the trail grew rough. It had been years since he'd been this close to another person for so long, and it unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite name. By midday, they stopped to rest the horses beside a small creek. As Beatrice washed trail dust from her face, Daniel observed her more carefully. Despite her fine speech and education, there was a resilience to her that many Eastern ladies lacked. She hadn't complained once about the hard pace or uncomfortable riding. "You've been on your own before," he said, not quite a question. Beatrice looked up, water droplets clinging to her lashes. "What makes you say that?" "You adapt quickly. Most women of your background would be demanding stops every hour or complaining about the discomfort." A small smile played at her lips. "My father kept me sheltered, but my mother was different. Before she died, she taught me that a woman should be able to manage for herself if necessary." Her smile faded. "After she passed, I realized I would need those skills sooner rather than later." "How long ago was that?" 3 years. I was 17 when we lost her. That's when my father began to change. Or perhaps that's when I began to see him clearly." Beatrice wrung water from her handkerchief. "And you, Mr. Zachary? You strike me as someone who has been managing for himself for quite some time." Daniel nodded, surprising himself by answering honestly. "Since I was 15. My father left, and my mother wasn't far behind him." "I'm sorry," Beatrice said, and Daniel could tell she meant it. "It taught me to rely on myself," he replied with a shrug. "Out here, that's not a bad lesson to learn." "Perhaps," Beatrice said thoughtfully. "But is it the only lesson worth learning?" Before Daniel could consider her question, a distant sound caught his attention. Hoofbeats, moving fast, and coming their way. "Riders," he said quietly. "We need to move." They mounted quickly, Daniel leading them away from the creek and into a stand of pines that provided cover. Through the trees, they watched as 3 riders, Roe and his companions, thundered past on the main trail. "They're heading straight for Triple R," Daniel realized aloud. "They must have figured out where we were going." Beatrice's face paled. "What do we do?" Daniel considered their options. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles east of here. We can wait there until dark, then circle around to the ranch. By then, the foreman will have sent those men on their way." As they rode toward the cabin, tensions settled between them. Daniel had never intended to become so entangled in Beatrice's problems. Yet here he was, hiding in the woods with a woman he barely knew while armed men searched for them. The cabin was little more than 4 walls and a roof, abandoned years ago, but still offering shelter. Inside, dust covered the single table and chair. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, though Daniel decided against lighting a fire that might draw attention. "We'll wait until nightfall," he said, unsaddling the horses and securing them behind the cabin where they wouldn't be visible from the trail. As afternoon stretched into evening, they shared the provisions Daniel had packed. The close quarters of the cabin made conversation inevitable. "Tell me about this teaching position in Helena," Daniel said as they ate dried beef and hardtack. "It's at a new school for minors' children," Beatrice explained. "The advertisement said they wanted someone with a proper education who wasn't afraid of frontier conditions." "And you're not?" "Afraid, I mean." Beatrice considered this. "I'm more afraid of the life my father planned for me than I am of whatever hardships Montana might present." "Marriage can't be worse than breaking your back in a mining camp," Daniel observed. "It depends on the marriage." Beatrice's voice grew quiet. "My father's choice, Mr. Hollister, has a reputation. His first wife died falling downstairs. His second from a mysterious fever. Both left him wealthier than before." She met Daniel's eyes. "I would rather face bears and blizzards than that man's household." The conviction in her voice silenced any doubts Daniel might have had about helping her. This wasn't some society girl's rebellion against an arranged marriage. This was survival. "My father believes women are property," Beatrice continued. "Assets to be traded for business advantages. My mother tried to shield me from that reality, but after she died," she trailed off, "I realized I had to save myself." "You have," Daniel said softly. "Whatever happens next, remember that. You've already proven yourself stronger than most." Beatrice smiled at him, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Zachary. Not just for the help, but for believing me." As darkness fell, they prepared to leave. The plan was to circle wide around the main trail to Triple R, approaching from the west where the land was more open and they could spot anyone following them. "Can you ride in the dark?" Daniel asked as he tightened the cinch on his saddle. "I can try," Beatrice replied. They set out under a sky brilliant with stars, moving slowly at first as their eyes adjusted to the darkness. Daniel led them through stands of pine and across small meadows. always keeping the North Star to their right as they made their circuitous route to the ranch. Around midnight, the main house of Triple R Ranch came into view, a large log structure with smaller bunkhouses and barns clustered nearby. Lanterns still burned in several windows, and Daniel could make out figures moving about. "Something's wrong," he murmured. "There shouldn't be so much activity at this hour." As they approached cautiously, the ranch foreman, Ellis Matthews, strode out to meet them, rifle in hand. "Zachary, thank God," Matthews said. "We've been looking for you. 3 men rode in a few hours ago asking questions. When we wouldn't tell them anything, they made threats. We've got the hands armed and watching the perimeter." Daniel dismounted, helping Beatrice down after him. "Matthews, this is Miss Zimmerman. Those men are after her, hired by her father to force her back to St. Louis." Matthews nodded to Beatrice. "Ma'am, any particular reason these men are so determined? They seemed ready to tear the place apart looking for you." Before Beatrice could answer, a shot rang out from the darkness beyond the ranch yard. Everyone ducked instinctively. "That'll be them," Matthews growled. "They circled back after we ran them off. Get inside, both of you." Daniel guided Beatrice toward the main house, keeping his body between her and the direction of the shot. As they reached the porch, more gunfire erupted. Ranch hands returned fire from defensive positions around the buildings. Inside, Mrs. Johnson, the cook, a formidable woman in her 50s, ushered them to the kitchen. "What in tarnation have you brought us, Daniel Zachary?" she demanded, eyeing Beatrice. "Trouble, ma'am," Daniel admitted, "but not of her making." Briefly, he explained Beatrice's situation. Mrs. Johnson's expression softened as she listened. "Well, you did right bringing her here," she said finally. "No woman should be forced into marriage, especially not to some villain who's already buried 2 wives. She patted Beatrice's hand. "Don't you worry, child. Triple R takes care of its own." Outside, the gunfire had stopped. Matthews entered the kitchen, his expression grim. "They've pulled back for now," he reported. "But they made their intentions clear. They want the woman, and they're willing to wait us out." "This is my fault," Beatrice said, distress evident in her voice. "I never meant to bring violence to your home." "Nonsense," Mrs. Johnson declared. "This is what men like that do. They bully and threaten until they get their way." "Well, not this time." Daniel moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "We can't stay under siege. The ranch has cattle to move, supplies to bring in." "What do you suggest?" Matthews asked. Daniel turned to Beatrice. "Those men, they're hired guns, right? Not family or men with personal loyalty to your father." She nodded. "Just hired men. My father pays well for results." "Then they have a price," Daniel said thoughtfully. "Every man has a price." Matthews caught his meaning immediately. "You think we can buy them off? Pay them more to leave than your father's paying them to stay?" "It's worth trying," Daniel replied. "How much cash do we have on hand?" The next morning, Daniel rode out alone, a white handkerchief tied to his rifle barrel. In the light of day, he could see Roe and his companions had made camp on a small rise overlooking the ranch, giving them a clear vantage point of anyone coming or going. As Daniel approached, Roe stood, hand near his pistol. "That's far enough, cowboy." Daniel halted his horse. "I've come to make you an offer." Roe laughed. "Unless you're offering to hand over the Zimmerman girl, we ain't interested." $200, Daniel said flatly. "Cash. You take it and ride away. Tell her father you never found her." This got their attention. The 3 men exchanged glances. "Her father's paying $300 for her safe return," Roe countered. "But you don't have her," Daniel pointed out. "And you won't get her. The ranch is well defended, and we've sent for the marshal. When he arrives, you'll be facing charges of trespassing and attempted murder." Roe spat on the ground. $300. Cash. And we leave immediately." $250, Daniel replied. "That's every dollar the ranch can spare." After a tense negotiation, they settled on the amount. Daniel returned to the ranch for the money, which Matthews counted out from the safe in his office. "This is mighty irregular," the foreman grumbled. "I'll have to explain this to the owner." "I'll pay it back from my wages if necessary," Daniel promised. When he delivered the money to Roe, the gunman counted it twice before tucking it into his coat. "Pleasure doing business," he said with a mocking tip of his hat. "One more thing," Daniel said as the men mounted up. "If you or anyone else comes back looking for Miss Zimmerman, the deal's off. We'll defend this ranch with everything we have." Roe studied him for a moment. "You know, Her father won't stop. He'll send others. That's our concern, not yours. You took the money, now ride. As the three men departed, Daniel watched until they disappeared over the horizon. He knew Roe was right. Beatrice's father wouldn't give up easily. But they had bought time, and sometimes on the frontier, that was all you could hope for. When Daniel returned to the ranch, Beatrice was waiting on the porch, anxiety evident in every line of her body. Are they gone? She asked. Daniel nodded. For now, we paid them to leave. Relief washed over her face, followed quickly by distress. You paid them? With the ranch's money? But I cannot possibly repay such a sum. You can work it off, Daniel interrupted gently. Mrs. Johnson still needs help in the kitchen, and you need somewhere safe to stay until your teaching position begins. It works out for everyone. Over the next few weeks, Beatrice settled into life at Triple R Ranch. Despite her genteel upbringing, she proved a quick study in the kitchen, earning Mrs. Johnson's grudging approval. The ranch hands, initially wary of the Eastern lady in their midst, soon warmed to her as she learned their names and preferences, ensuring each man's favorite dish appeared at least once a week. Daniel watched this transformation with growing admiration. Each day, Beatrice seemed to stand a little taller, speak a little more confidently. The frightened young woman from the stagecoach was giving way to someone stronger, someone who looked to the future with hope rather than fear. Their paths crossed frequently as Daniel went about his work with the horses. Sometimes he would find Beatrice watching him from the edge of the corral, a basket of eggs or bundle of herbs in her arms, taking a moment's respite from her kitchen duties. Other times, he would stop by the kitchen for coffee, lingering longer than necessary as Beatrice told him about the books she'd discovered in the ranch owner's library or her plans for the school in Helena. One evening, as October painted the mountains with gold and crimson, Daniel found Beatrice sitting alone on the porch steps, gazing at the sunset. "May I join you?" he asked. She smiled and made room beside her. "Please do." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the sun sank behind the distant peaks. "Your teaching position starts in less than a month," Daniel said finally. Beatrice nodded. "November 1st. I received confirmation last week that the position is still mine if I want it." "If?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I thought that was the plan all along." Beatrice tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture Daniel had come to recognize as a sign she was gathering her thoughts. It is. But, I've found unexpected contentment here," she admitted. "The work is hard, but there's satisfaction in it. The people are kind. I feel safe." Daniel understood what remained unspoken. Safety was a precious commodity for someone who had lived in fear. "Helena would be farther from St. Louis," he observed. "Less chance of your father's men finding you there." "True," Beatrice agreed. "Though I wonder if distance alone will ever be enough. My father is not a man who accepts defeat." Another silence fell between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken thoughts. "What about you, Daniel?" Beatrice asked suddenly. "Will you stay at Triple R? Or does the Cowboy's restlessness call to you?" The question caught him off guard. For years, Daniel had never stayed at one ranch for more than a season or two, always moving on before connections could form, before people could come to expect things from him, or he from them. "I hadn't thought much beyond winter," he admitted. "Triple R is a good outfit. Fair pay, decent treatment." "But," Beatrice prompted, echoing his earlier question. Daniel looked out at the darkening landscape. "But a man gets to thinking sometimes about having something of his own. A small spread, maybe. Enough land to raise good horses. A dream worth having," Beatrice said softly. Daniel glanced at her, struck by the genuine understanding in her eyes. Not pity or judgment, but recognition of the yearning for something permanent in a world built on transience. Before he could respond, hoofbeats sounded from the road leading to the ranch. Daniel tensed, instantly alert. They hadn't seen Roe or his companions since paying them off, but the threat of their return lingered. A lone rider appeared, silhouetted against the last light of day. As he approached, Daniel recognized the local marshal, Hayes. "Evening, Zachary," Hayes called, dismounting with a grunt. "Miss Zimmerman about?" Beatrice stood. "I'm here, Marshal. Is something wrong?" Hayes removed his hat, revealing a balding head and a concerned expression. "Got a telegram from St. Louis today. Man named Zimmerman asking after his daughter. Says she's been kidnapped by a cowhand named Zachary." Daniel felt Beatrice stiffen beside him. That's absurd, she said firmly. I left St. Louis of my own free will. Mr. Zachary has only offered assistance when I found myself in difficulty. Hayes nodded. Figured as much. But this telegram, it includes instructions to arrest you, Zachary, and return the young lady to St. Louis under escort. On what charges? Daniel demanded. Kidnapping. Theft. Says you stole family heirlooms worth a small fortune. Hayes sighed. Look, I know it's horse apples, but her father's got influence. Judge in St. Louis issued the warrant. Beatrice's hand found Daniel's arm, gripping tightly. This is exactly what I feared. He's using the law to force my return. Hayes shuffled uncomfortably. I ain't here to arrest nobody. Just thought you should know what's coming. Telegram mentioned he's sending men with proper documentation. Probably be here within the week. After the marshal left, promising to delay any official action as long as possible, Beatrice paced the porch in agitation. I have to leave, she said, her voice tight with anxiety. Tonight, before they arrive with those papers. Daniel caught her gently by the shoulders. Beatrice, stop. Think. Running blindly won't help. What choice do I have? Tears of frustration shone in her eyes. If they come with legal documents, even Marshal Hayes won't be able to interfere. They'll take me back to St. Louis, and my father will ensure I never escape again. Daniel felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. I won't let that happen. How can you stop it? The law is on his side. Daniel considered their options. The law in Montana Territory might not recognize a warrant from St. Louis, especially if we can prove coercion. And you're of age, 20, you said? Yes. But, then legally, your father cannot force you to return or to marry. But we need time to establish that. Time we don't have if you flee again. Beatrice looked up at him, searching his face. What are you suggesting? The idea had been forming in Daniel's mind without his conscious awareness. A solution both practical and utterly life-changing. Marry me. Beatrice stared at him, shock evident in her expression. What? As your husband, I would have legal standing to protect you. Your father's claim of kidnapping becomes absurd if you're my wife. And no court in the territory would force a married woman to return to her father. Daniel, Beatrice faltered. That's not a solution. Marriage is a legal arrangement, Daniel finished for her. One that would protect you. Nothing more need change between us. After the danger passes, we could seek an annulment if you wish. Beatrice stepped away, creating distance between them. You would enter into a marriage, the most sacred of bonds, as nothing more than a legal shield. Daniel realized his mistake immediately. In his practical frontier thinking, he had reduced marriage to its barest legal function, ignoring its deeper meanings, especially to someone like Beatrice, who had fought so hard to avoid a loveless arrangement. I'm sorry, he said quietly. That was poorly expressed. I only meant to offer protection, not to presume. I understand your intention. Beatrice interrupted, her voice gentler now. And I appreciate your willingness to help. But I cannot accept such a sacrifice. It's no sacrifice, Daniel found himself saying, the words coming from someplace deeper than he'd allowed himself to acknowledge. Beatrice, these past weeks, I've come to care for you. More than I expected. More than is probably wise. The admission hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Daniel, Beatrice said softly, caring born of circumstance isn't enough basis for marriage. You've been alone too long, and I've been running too hard. Neither of us is thinking clearly. Her rejection stung, though Daniel knew she was right. Still, something in him refused to accept defeat. Then what will you do? Because I meant what I said, I won't let them take you back. Beatrice's expression softened. Why does it matter so much to you? The question struck at the heart of everything Daniel had been avoiding. Why did it matter? Why had he involved himself in her troubles from the beginning? Why had this woman, of all people, broken through the careful isolation he had maintained for years? Because when I'm with you, he said slowly, finding the words as he spoke them, I remember there's more to life than just surviving it. Because you're brave and determined and kind, and the thought of you being forced into a life you don't want makes me angry in ways I can barely understand. He took a deep breath. Because for the first time since I was a boy, I'm not alone in my own head all the time, and I don't want to go back to that silence. Beatrice's eyes widened at his raw honesty. For a moment, she said nothing, and Daniel feared he had said too much. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of my father, or his men, or even of the future. I'm afraid of trusting someone so completely again. The last time I did." "I know," Daniel said. "I know exactly what that fear feels like." Their eyes held, a moment of perfect understanding passing between them. "I need time," Beatrice finally said. "Not to decide whether to trust you. I already do, more than I've trusted anyone in years. But to be certain this isn't just gratitude or circumstance." Daniel nodded, relief washing through him that she hadn't rejected the idea outright. "Time is the one thing we don't have much of." Hayes said a week at most. "Then we have a week to figure this out," Beatrice replied with determination. Together. 3 days later, Daniel rode into Silver Creek for supplies and information. At the telegraph office, he sent a message to a lawyer in Helena whom Matthews had recommended, a man known for handling complex legal matters in the territory. As Daniel left the telegraph office, a familiar figure caught his eye, Roe, lounging outside the saloon. Their gazes met, and the gunman smirked. Daniel's hand instinctively moved closer to his revolver as he crossed the street. "Thought you'd left the territory," Daniel said coolly. Roe took a long drag from his cigarette. "Found a reason to stay. Our agreement was that we'd leave. Never said anything about not coming back." Roe's smile widened. "Besides, got a better offer. Seems Miss Zimmerman's father wasn't satisfied with our report. Doubled the payment for her safe return." Daniel tensed. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." "That's where you're wrong, Cowboy." Roe flicked his cigarette into the dirt. "See those two gentlemen over at the hotel?" He nodded toward two well-dressed men conversing with the stage driver, deputy marshal from Missouri and a family lawyer. "Got all the proper papers to take the girl back. They'll be heading out to your ranch tomorrow morning." Daniel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Legal papers don't change the fact that she's a grown woman who makes her own choices. Roe laughed. "Tell that to the judge who signed the order declaring her mentally incompetent to manage her own affairs. Her father's had physicians swear she's suffering from feminine hysteria or some such nonsense. By law, she's in his custody until she's examined by court-appointed doctors back in St. Louis." The information hit Daniel like a physical blow. They'd anticipated her father might try legal means, but not this particular strategy. Declaring Beatrice mentally unfit was a devious move, one that circumvented her status as an adult. "Thought you'd want to know," Roe continued, clearly enjoying Daniel's reaction. "Being so concerned for the lady's welfare and all." Daniel leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. "If you come near her again, our previous arrangement won't matter. I'll kill you myself." Roe's hand drifted toward his pistol. "Big talk from a horse trainer." "Try me," Daniel said simply, his eyes never leaving Roe's. After a tense moment, Roe stepped back. "No need for that. I get paid either way. Those gentlemen will handle the legal side. I'm just making sure no one interferes." He tipped his hat mockingly. "Good day, Zachary." Daniel completed his purchases as quickly as possible and rode hard for R, his mind racing through possibilities. The legal trap Zimmerman had set was clever. By declaring Beatrice incompetent, he rendered her adult status meaningless. Even marriage might not protect her against such a claim. When he arrived at the ranch, Daniel found Beatrice in the garden behind the kitchen, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables before frost claimed them. "We have trouble," he said without preamble, explaining what he'd learned in town. Beatrice listened, her face growing paler with each word. "Mentally incompetent," she whispered when he finished. "He would go that far?" "Apparently," Daniel confirmed grimly. "They'll be here tomorrow with papers. We need to decide what to do tonight." Inside the main house, they gathered with Matthews, Mrs. Johnson, and two of the senior ranch hands to discuss options. "If we challenge this legally, it could take weeks," Matthews pointed out. "Meanwhile, they'll have taken Miss Zimmerman back to St. Louis." "What about running?" Mrs. Johnson suggested. "The Caldwell place up in the high country is empty this time of year. You could hide there until winter makes the pass impassable." "And then what?" Beatrice asked. "Live as fugitives?" "I can't ask Daniel to throw away his life for me." Daniel, who had been thinking silently, finally spoke. "There's one option we haven't fully considered. If we can prove Beatrice is of sound mind before they arrive with those papers, it might negate their claims." "How do we do that?" Matthews asked. "We get witnesses, respected members of the community, to sign affidavits testifying to her mental competence. The marshal, Mrs. Holloway from town, Reverend Taylor, the bank manager. Beatrice frowned. Would that be enough? My father has physicians' statements. Physicians who likely never examined you, Daniel pointed out. If we can get Dr. Miller to examine you and declare you sound, that might carry weight against claims made by doctors hundreds of miles away. It's worth trying, Matthews agreed. I'll ride into town tonight and start gathering those statements. As night fell, the plan took shape. Matthews returned from town with signed statements from several respected citizens attesting to Beatrice's mental soundness. Dr. Miller had agreed to examine her first thing in the morning and provide his professional opinion. But as Daniel and Beatrice sat alone in the ranch's small library after the others had gone to bed, doubt lingered. What if it's not enough? Beatrice asked quietly. What if they take me anyway and sort out the legal issues later? Once I'm back in St. Louis, my father will ensure I never leave again. Daniel gazed into the dying fire. There's still the option I suggested before. Marriage, Beatrice said softly. Yes, but not as I proposed it then. Daniel turned to face her. Not as a mere legal shield. Beatrice, these past days, seeing you in danger again, facing the possibility of losing you, have made things clearer for me. He took her hands in his. I care for you. Deeply. In ways I haven't allowed myself to care for anyone in a very long time. I can't promise I know exactly what love is supposed to feel like, but I know that when I think of you going back to St. Louis, it feels like something vital is being torn away from me. Beatrice's eyes glistened in the firelight. Daniel, let me finish, he said gently. I understand we haven't known each other long, that in normal circumstances, this would be considered hasty. But these aren't normal circumstances, and I find myself unable to imagine going back to the way things were before you arrived. He squeezed her hands. I'm asking you to marry me. Not temporarily, not as a strategy, but because I want to build something with you. A life, a home, a future. Whatever that looks like, wherever it takes us. Tears spilled down Beatrice's cheeks. You don't know what you're asking. My father won't simply give up. He could make life impossible for you. Let him try, Daniel said with quiet confidence. I've faced worse odds. Beatrice searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, she took a trembling breath. You've never even kissed me, she whispered. Daniel smiled. An oversight I'd like to correct, if you'll permit me. When their lips met, the last of Daniel's doubts dissolved. In that moment, he understood what he'd been fighting against for so long. Not just connection, but the vulnerability that came with it. The possibility of loss that accompanied love. As they parted, Beatrice's eyes remained closed for a moment longer, as if memorizing the feeling. Yes, she said when she opened them. I will marry you, Daniel Zachary. Not out of fear or necessity, but because in the strangest of circumstances, I found the bravest, most honorable man I've ever known. Dawn found them at Reverend Taylor's small church in Silver Creek, with Matthews, Mrs. Johnson, and Dr. Miller as witnesses. The ceremony was brief but genuine, with promises exchanged that went far beyond the legal protections they sought. As Daniel slipped a simple gold band onto Beatrice's finger, purchased hastily from the general store the previous evening, he felt a sense of rightness that defied logical explanation. This woman, who had entered his life as a stranger in need, now stood beside him as his wife. When Reverend Taylor pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed Beatrice with a tenderness that conveyed everything words could not: protection, promise, and the beginnings of a love neither had expected to find. They had just signed the marriage certificate when the church door opened. The deputy marshal from Missouri entered, followed by a severe-looking man in an expensive suit and robe, who lingered in the doorway with a smirk. Beatrice Zimmerman, the deputy called, unaware of what he had interrupted. Beatrice Zachary, she corrected firmly, her hand tightening around Daniel's. As of about 10 minutes ago, the lawyer stepped forward, his expression darkening. This is an obvious attempt to circumvent legal proceedings. We have papers declaring Miss Zimmerman incompetent to manage her affairs, including the decision to marry. Daniel nodded to Dr. Miller, who produced his statement. And we have a medical examination conducted just this morning declaring Mrs. Zachary of perfectly sound mind, along with affidavits from multiple respected citizens of this territory who have interacted with her regularly. The deputy marshal reviewed the documents with growing discomfort. These seem to be in order, he admitted reluctantly. Furthermore, Daniel continued, Montana territory law recognizes the right of a woman of legal age to marry without parental consent. The marriage is legal and binding. The lawyer sputtered in outrage. This is preposterous. Her father will contest this sham immediately. He is welcome to try, Reverend Taylor interjected mildly. But I assure you, the ceremony was conducted properly, with willing participants and legitimate witnesses. The union is blessed in the eyes of God and recognized by territorial law. A tense standoff ensued as the lawyer conferred quietly with the deputy. Finally, the deputy sighed and approached Beatrice. Ma'am, I need to ask you directly. Are you being coerced in any way? Have you entered into this marriage willingly? Beatrice met his gaze steadily. I have entered this marriage with a clear mind and an open heart. My father has been attempting to force me into an unwanted marriage to advance his business interests. I left St. Louis to escape that fate. Everything else is a fabrication designed to control me. The deputy nodded slowly. I understand. And while I sympathize with your father's concerns, the law is clear. As a married woman of legal age, you cannot be compelled to return to your father's household against your will. The lawyer wasn't ready to concede. This isn't over. Mr. Zimmerman will pursue this through every legal channel available. Tell Mr. Zimmerman, Daniel said firmly, that his daughter is safe and happy, and that I'll stand between her and whatever follows, be it hired guns or legal papers. As the men from St. Louis departed, Beatrice turned to Daniel, relief and wonder mingling in her expression. Is it really over? For now, Daniel answered honestly. Your father may try other approaches, but we'll face them together. Mrs. Johnson clapped her hands briskly. Well, this calls for a celebration. I've got a special dinner to prepare. And you too. She pointed at Daniel and Beatrice. Have some time to yourselves before you're expected back at the ranch. As their friends departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in the small church, Daniel took Beatrice's hands in his. I know this isn't how most marriages begin, he said softly. And I want you to know that nothing needs to change between us until you're ready. We can take this as slowly as you need. Beatrice stepped closer, resting her hand against his cheek. Daniel Zachary, I married you because in the short time I've known you, you've shown me more respect, more kindness, and more understanding than any man I've ever met. I don't need more time to know my own mind or heart. Spring, 1876. The small cabin stood on a ridge overlooking a valley where horses grazed in the new grass. Daniel watched from the porch as Beatrice hung laundry on the line, her movements graceful despite her advancing pregnancy. The past months had brought challenges, as they'd expected. Beatrice's father had indeed pursued legal action, but the combination of distance, Daniel's careful documentation, and Beatrice's clear competence had frustrated his efforts. The final attempt, a lawsuit claiming Daniel had manipulated Beatrice for her inheritance, had failed when Beatrice testified that she had left her inheritance behind, taking only what her mother had specifically left to her. After 6 months at RRR, they had purchased this small parcel of land with their combined savings. It wasn't much yet, 80 acres, a sturdy cabin, and a small stable where Daniel bred and trained horses. But it was theirs, free and clear, with room to grow. Beatrice had written to the school in Helena, declining the teaching position but offering to help establish a small school closer to home once their child was born. Her knowledge and refinement, coupled with Daniel's practical frontier skills, had quickly earned them the respect of neighboring ranchers and townspeople alike. As Daniel watched his wife in the spring sunshine, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed. The man who had once believed that isolation was the only safe way to live now found his greatest joy in connection. To Beatrice, to the land they were making their own, and to the child who would join them before summer's end. Beatrice looked up, catching his gaze, and smiled. That same radiant smile that had first cracked the walls around his heart. She set down her basket and walked toward him, one hand resting on the swell of her belly. Daydreaming, cowboy? She asked teasingly as she joined him on the porch. Daniel pulled her gently into his arms. Remembering, and looking forward. To what? She leaned against him, fitting perfectly against his side. To everything, he said simply. To all of it. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the mountains gold. In the distance, their horses grazed peacefully, and a meadowlark's song drifted on the evening breeze. Daniel Zachary, once determined to stand alone against the world, now stood with his family, facing whatever might follow, together.